A year passed since my beloved wife died. For 12 months, I allowed her sewing room to remain locked. It was a silent shrine to the woman who was my world. I only opened that door because a hidden pipe burst seeping water into the hallway. I was pulling into the church parking lot when the plumber called. His voice trembled so violently, I could barely understand his words. He told me to go home immediately, but to go alone. He refused to explain why, repeating the warning over and over. When I walked back into that damp room and saw what was hidden inside her walls, I wished I had never unlocked that door. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The drive back to my house in the quiet Chicago suburbs usually took 15 minutes, but that Sunday morning felt like an eternity. My mind raced through terrifying possibilities. Mike Dawson was a reliable man, a local plumber I had trusted for a decade. He was the kind of guy who talked your ear off about baseball, always quick with a smile. But on the phone, Mike sounded terrified. He sounded like a man who had stared into the eyes of a ghost. He left my front door unlocked, left his tools behind, and refused to accept $1. He just wanted to get away from my property as fast as possible. As I navigated the tree-lined streets, my thoughts drifted to my son David. When my beautiful Martha died of sudden heart failure a year ago, my world collapsed. After her funeral, David was the one who insisted we lock her sewing room. He stood in the hallway, his arm wrapped around his wife, Sarah, telling me we needed to preserve her memory. He said seeing her sewing machine and unfinished fabrics every day would only break my fragile heart further. He took the brass key, patted my shoulder with deep concern, and put it on the high shelf in the kitchen. I was so consumed by grief that I believed his lie completely. I genuinely thought my son was protecting me. I never imagined he was hiding a sinister secret. I pulled into my driveway and slammed the truck into park. Mike's van was gone. He had fled the scene. The morning air felt thick and suffocating as I walked up the pathway. I pushed the front door. It swung open with an agonizing creak. The house was dead silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. The scent of wet drywall and rotting wood hit my nose instantly. I walked down the hallway, my boots making dull thuds on the carpet, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. I stepped carefully into Martha's sewing room. On the surface, it was exactly as she had left it. Her sewing machine sat proudly on the desk. Her colorful fabrics rested neatly on the upper shelves. But the large oak bookshelf on the far wall had been shoved violently aside. Behind it, a massive jagged hole had been smashed through the white drywall. I stepped closer, my breathing growing shallow. Inside the dark hollow space between the wooden studs sat a heavy-duty biometric steel safe. The water from the leaking copper pipe above had dripped directly onto it for weeks, completely destroying the electronic lock. Mike had clearly used his steel crowbar to pry the rusted door open, leaving it hanging precariously on a single bent hinge. He had seen what was inside, and the sight alone had sent a grown man running for his life. I knelt down on the damp carpet, my knees quickly soaking up the cold, stagnant water that had pooled beneath the baseboards. As an engineer, my eyes instinctively analyzed the structural failure before me. The copper pipe hadn't just sprung a random leak. The threading at the joint showed signs of unnatural, prolonged stress, perhaps inadvertently weakened, when the massive safe was violently wedged between the load-bearing studs. The safe itself was a high-end commercial model, built to withstand raging fires and brute force break-ins. Its presence here, hidden behind a false wall in my own home, was a profound violation of my sanctuary. I ran my rough fingers along the jagged edges of the smashed drywall. The white gypsum powder stuck to my skin like chalk dust crumbling under my touch. The air in the tight space was thick with the metallic tang of rusted iron and the unmistakable sour stench of black mildew that had been quietly festering in the dark for months. How many times had I walked past this very wall? How many times had I stood in the hallway, overwhelmed by the crushing grief of losing Martha, completely unaware that a monument to my own destruction was silently corroding just inches away. The biometric scanner on the safe's heavy steel door was completely fried, the sensitive internal electronics short-circuited by the relentless daily drip of water. Mike must have used every ounce of his bodily strength to pry the locking bolts out of their casings. I peered into the dark, rusted interior. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, hiding the sins of the boy I had raised. Before I even reached my arm inside, a primal, suffocating dread settled heavy in my chest. It was the same instinctual, gut-wrenching warning I used to get standing beneath a structurally compromised bridge just before a catastrophic collapse. The foundation of my family was already gone. I was just looking at the rubble. I reached my trembling arm into the dark cavity. My fingers brushed against a thick plastic trash bag. I pulled it out carefully, feeling its surprising density. I placed it gently on Martha's sewing desk, pushing aside some old thread spools to make room. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I untied the tight knot at the top. I did not know what to expect. Was it stolen money, illegal narcotics, something terrible my son had hidden away to protect himself from a bad business deal? What I finally pulled out of that bag was far worse than anything my rational engineering mind could have conjured. I pulled out an organized stack of legal documents. The paper felt heavy, official, and expensive. I put on my reading glasses and squinted at the fine print. The very first document was the original property deed to my house. The home I had spent 30 long years paying off with blood, sweat, and overtime. The home where I had built a beautiful, honest life. But it was no longer in my name. The deed had been heavily modified and legally notarized by a complete stranger. Ownership of my estate had been transferred to my son, David Bennett. My signature was resting at the bottom of the page, perfectly and maliciously forged. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. I dug deeper into the dark plastic bag with frantic desperation. I pulled out a sleek folder bearing the logo of a major corporate insurance firm. I flipped the cover open. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy, a double indemnity policy taken out specifically on my life. The payout number, printed in bold ink, was a staggering $5 million. The sole listed beneficiary was David. I looked down at the date printed at the very bottom of the contract, right next to another forged signature. My blood ran ice-cold, freezing solid in my veins. The document was not dated recently. It was dated the exact same week my wife Martha had suddenly died. My mind began to spin, trying to connect the horrifying dots. My son had stolen my home. My son had insured my life for a massive fortune. But the terrifying documents were not the end of the nightmare. At the very bottom of the plastic bag, wrapped in layers of protective bubble wrap, was a small cardboard box. I tore through the wrapping and opened the lid. Inside rested 3 small glass vials. They contained a heavy, concentrated liquid drug. I picked one up and rotated it toward the light. The medical labels were clearly marked in bold, clinical print. It was a medication designed to induce sudden cardiac arrest. And the most chilling detail of all was printed right on the front. The lethal medication was prescribed directly under my name. For a moment, the walls of the small sewing room seemed to aggressively, violently inward. A sudden, terrifying wave of vertigo washed over me, sending me stumbling backward until my spine slammed hard against the doorframe. My lungs desperately clawed for oxygen, but the damp, heavy air refused to fill them. My vision blurred at the edges, tunneling down to the 3 small glass vials resting innocuously in the cardboard box. I was experiencing a severe acute panic attack. The sheer, incomprehensible weight of the betrayal was physically crushing my chest. My mind flashed to a warm summer afternoon 25 years ago. I remembered building a wooden treehouse in the backyard for a terrified, crying 7-year-old David, promising him that as long as I was alive, nothing in this world would ever be allowed to hurt him. I had spent my entire life shielding him from the cold realities of the world, and in return, he had quietly forged the very blade meant for my back. The agonizing contrast between the innocent boy I raised and the clinical murderer who owned that safe threatened to completely shatter my sanity. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced myself to rely on the only coping mechanism I had ever known, pure, unadulterated mathematics. I am a builder. When a structure destabilizes you, do not panic. You identify the anchor points. I forced my breathing into a rigid geometric rhythm. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4. I opened my eyes and started identifying the structural components of the room out loud, in a harsh, ragged whisper. Standard half-inch gypsum drywall, 16-inch spaced pine studs, copper piping 3/4-inch diameter, load-bearing header above the window frame. I repeated the architectural facts over and over until the dizzying emotional storm began to recede, replaced by a cold metallic numbness. The frantic, grieving father, who had walked into this house 10 minutes ago, was officially dead, buried under the weight of those forged documents. I stood up straight, my joints popping in the quiet room. I am a retired structural engineer. I walk 3 miles every morning. I have never had a single heart issue in my entire 70 years of life. I was staring at the exact tools of my own impending murder. They were planning to kill me, and they were planning to make it look natural. Suddenly, the metallic click of the front door lock, echoing down the hallway, shattered the suffocating silence. The heavy oak door swung open with a loud thud, and I heard Sarah's sharp, arrogant laugh bouncing off the walls, closely followed by the heavy, familiar footsteps of my son, walking directly into the house, completely unaware that his father was standing just a few feet away, holding the evidence of his crimes. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in psychological torture. I sat at the head of my own dining, the heavy oak table I had carefully carved, sanded and stained with my own hands over 3 decades ago. The roasted chicken and garlic potatoes sitting on my delicate porcelain plate looked absolutely perfect, but to my stomach, it might as well have been a pile of dry sawdust. My hands were finally steady, tucked neatly beneath the white linen tablecloth, but my mind was violently dissecting the horror I had just unearthed in the hallway. David and Sarah sat across from me, pouring tall glasses of expensive Merlot and chatting happily about the trivial annoyances of their day. Watching them smile, watching them comfortably occupy the home they had legally stolen from me required every ounce of discipline I had built over my 70 years of life. I had to play the part of the frail, grieving widower perfectly. I had to let them believe their foundation was completely secure and untouchable. I slowly cut a piece of chicken, forcing myself to chew and swallow, while the metallic taste of betrayal sat heavily on my tongue. The grandfather clock ticked quietly in the background, a steady, echoing rhythm that felt like a terrifying countdown to my own sudden demise. I waited until Sarah was halfway through an animated story about a difficult real estate client she was dealing with in the city. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water, carefully clearing my throat, to draw their attention across the table. I kept my voice light, injecting just a hint of elderly confusion and mild curiosity into my tone. I told David that I had found a strange envelope resting on the kitchen counter earlier that afternoon. I described it vaguely, saying it looked like a dense legal document from a major corporate insurance firm, and asked if he had accidentally left some of his work files out in the open. As I spoke, I watched his eyes with intense scrutiny. I am a retired structural engineer, and my entire professional career was built on finding the microscopic stress fractures in massive concrete pillars before they could collapse. I was looking for the stress fracture in my son. I was waiting for a twitch, a drop of sweat, a sudden break in his confident posture that would prove he possessed a conscience. David did not flinch at all. His heart rate did not appear to rise. His hands did not tremble even a fraction of an inch. He simply set his crystal wine glass down on the table, wiped his mouth elegantly with a cloth napkin, and smiled with a terrifying practiced warmth. He leaned forward across the oak wood, adopting the patient, soothing tone one might use to explain a very simple concept to a confused child. He told me it was absolutely nothing to worry about. He smoothly explained that the paperwork was just a standard corporate policy tax shield. He claimed that he and Sarah had utilized his investment firm's lucrative executive benefits to set up a comprehensive life insurance plan for me. His voice was thick with manufactured concern as he spun an elaborate web about the rising costs of assisted living facilities and unpredictable long-term medical care. He placed his hand gently over mine on the table, looking me dead in the eyes, and promised that this was just a financial placeholder to ensure I would never have to worry about expensive medical bills in my old age. Sarah immediately chimed in, resting her chin on her hand, softly adding that they just wanted to make sure I was completely protected. As I sat there listening to the melodic, comforting rhythm of my son's deception, a heavy wave of realization washed over me. I remembered this exact tone of voice. I remembered this precise, unwavering eye contact. It was the exact same smooth, confident delivery David had used 15 years ago when he sat in our living room and begged for $100,000 to pay for his elite business school degree. He had promised me and Martha with tears of sincerity in his eyes that it was a strict loan. He had sworn on his honor that he would pay us back every single penny with interest the moment he secured his first corporate job. He never once paid back a dime. When his career took off and his lifestyle inflated with luxury cars and tailored designer suits, he conveniently developed amnesia regarding his massive debt. Martha, with her infinite gentle grace, had quietly convinced me to let it go. She always made excuses for him, saying that our son was just trying to establish himself in a ruthless corporate world. I had let it slide for my wife's sake. Now, looking at the man sitting across my dining table, I realized how catastrophically blind I had been. David was not just a bad borrower. He was a spectacular clinical liar. He could stare into the eyes of the family who gave him everything and lie with the mechanical precision of a ticking clock. He felt absolutely no remorse. Watching him now swirling the dark red Merlot in his crystal glass with elegant ease, I felt a sickening disconnect between the man sitting before me and the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders at the local county fairs. Where had this rot truly started? Was it a gradual, invisible decay, a slow erosion of empathy, fueled by corporate greed and a relentless desperation for high society status? Or had this cold, calculating predator always lived inside him, cleverly disguised beneath a charming smile and a silver tongue? I shifted my gaze slightly toward Sarah. She was carefully slicing her prime rib, her movements incredibly precise and delicate. If David was the loud, arrogant architect of this monstrous deception, Sarah was undoubtedly the silent, lethal enforcer. Her eyes, a pale, icy blue, tracked my every movement with the predatory patience of a hawk observing a wounded rabbit. She projected an aura of absolute suburban perfection. The flawless blonde hair, the understated designer jewelry, the soft melodic voice, but beneath that polished veneer lay a chilling, bottomless emptiness. When she noticed me looking, her lips curled into a gentle, sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her cold eyes. She reached across the white linen tablecloth with a manicured hand to adjust the silver salt shaker, a subtle display of her total control over my environment. The sheer audacity of their performance was mesmerizing in its cruelty. They were treating my life, my memories, my home, my very breath as nothing more than a tedious administrative hurdle standing between them and their next luxury purchase. I took another bite of the roasted chicken, forcing my jaw to aggressively grind the dry meat. The expensive garlic and herbs tasted exactly like ash in my mouth. I had to consciously suppress the violent tremor building in my hands, burying the urge to strike them deep within my core. I could not afford to let them see the raging inferno of hatred that was rapidly replacing my grief. To survive this dinner, I had to become exactly what they believed I was, an oblivious, fading old man, stepping willingly into the grave they had so meticulously dug for him. I smiled back at him. I nodded my head slowly, forcing a look of profound gratitude onto my weathered face. I thanked him for being such a responsible and caring son. I told him I was incredibly lucky to have children who cared so deeply about my future well-being and security. David visibly relaxed his shoulders, dropping, as he took a long, victorious sip of his red wine. Sarah returned to eating her dinner completely satisfied that the old fool had bought their story, hook, line, and sinker. They believed they were completely in control of the narrative. But beneath my polite smile, a silent, deafening alarm was screaming in my head. David's lie about setting up a recent corporate tax shield for my future medical care was a masterful piece of fiction, but he had made a critical, fatal error in his calculations. He did not know that I had already broken into that hidden safe behind the drywall. He did not know that I had actually put on my reading glasses and examined the fine print at the very bottom of that $5 million policy. While David continued to talk cheerfully about his upcoming weekend golf tournament with his wealthy corporate friends. My mind was anchored to the bold black ink of the signature date printed on that hidden contract. The policy was not a recent placeholder for future medical care. The documents had not been drawn up in the last few weeks. I remembered the exact day, the exact month, and the exact year printed on that page. It was signed the exact same week my healthy, vibrant Martha had suddenly and inexplicably died in her sleep. In that horrifying moment of crystal-clear realization, the final piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. The devastating truth practically choked me. My son had not merely stolen the roof over my head. My only child had methodically and ruthlessly orchestrated the absolute murder of his own mother. The remainder of that dinner was an agonizing exercise in survival. Every muscle in my body screamed to lunge across the table, to grab my son by his tailored collar, and demand to know how he could look into his mother's eyes as he stole her life. But my decades as an engineer had taught me that acting on raw emotion during a structural crisis only guarantees a fatal collapse. I forced my hands to remain perfectly still in my lap. I forced my breathing to slow down to a steady, rhythmic pace. I smiled politely and nodded along as David continued to brag about his golf handicap and his upcoming corporate retreats. I chewed the food they had prepared, swallowing the bitter ash of betrayal with every single bite. They sat there in the warm ambient light of the dining room, looking like the perfect, successful suburban couple. They were completely convinced that they had successfully pacified a confused, grieving old man. They had no idea that behind my quiet, agreeable demeanor, I was meticulously cataloging every word they said, building a silent, indestructible case against them. When the plates were finally cleared, David retired to the living room sofa, loosening his silk tie and scrolling through his expensive smartphone with an air of complete detachment. Sarah remained in the kitchen, insisting that she take care of the dishes. She told me to go sit in my favorite recliner by the window, the one Martha had bought for my 60th birthday. As I sank into the worn leather cushions, I listened to the familiar sounds coming from the kitchen. I heard the clinking of ceramic mugs, the gentle rush of tap water, and the low hum of the microwave. A few minutes later, Sarah walked into the living room, holding a steaming mug on a small saucer. The sweet herbal aroma of chamomile and lavender wafted through the air. This was a new nightly ritual she had firmly established about 3 months ago. She claimed it was a special organic blend designed to help me sleep through the night, insisting my grief was keeping me awake and deteriorating my health. Sarah knelt beside my recliner, placing the warm mug gently on the side table. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with manufactured tears that looked incredibly convincing. She reached out and placed her soft, manicured hand over mine, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. She told me how deeply she and David loved me, how it absolutely broke their hearts to see my memory failing me lately. She spun a tragic, sympathetic narrative, claiming my recent bouts of confusion and sudden dizzy spells were clear signs that I needed more rest. She practically begged me to drink the tea while it was hot, swearing it was the only thing keeping my fragile mind stable. Sitting there looking down at her flawless performance, I felt a deep, chilling revulsion. I thanked her profusely, patting her hand and promising I would finish every last drop. She offered a sad, comforting smile, stood up, and walked over to join David on the sofa. I wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic mug, bringing it slowly toward my face. As the herbal steam rose into my nostrils, a sickening epiphany struck me with the force of a physical blow. The timeline of my sudden health decline aligned perfectly with the introduction of this nightly tea ritual. For the past 3 months, I had been experiencing terrifying moments of disorientation. I would wake up feeling dizzy, my heart racing uncontrollably in my chest, my memory fogged by a heavy, unnatural exhaustion. David and Sarah used those exact symptoms to casually suggest to my neighbors and our family doctor that I was rapidly developing dementia. I realized with absolute certainty that my cognitive decline was not a natural product of aging or grief. I was being systematically and deliberately poisoned. They were microdosing me with a heavy sedative, laying the medical groundwork for my impending natural-looking death. I brought the mug to my lips, tilting my head back as if I were taking a deep, satisfying swallow. In reality, I kept my lips firmly sealed, letting the hot liquid pool harmlessly against my teeth before lowering the mug. I let out a contented sigh, praising Sarah for her wonderful brewing skills. I waited patiently until David and Sarah became deeply engrossed in a television show. When their eyes were locked on the screen, I slipped a small, empty prescription vial from my shirt pocket. Moving with calculated, slow precision, I poured a generous sample of the laced tea directly into the glass container, sealing the plastic cap tightly. I quickly slipped the vial back into my pocket safe and secure. Then I tipped the rest of the tea into the potted fern sitting next to my chair, leaving just a few damp leaves at the bottom of the mug to complete the illusion. I stood up slowly, groaning slightly, to emphasize my supposed frailty. I announced that I was feeling exhausted and was going to take the trash out before heading up to bed. David barely looked away from the television, simply waving a dismissive hand and telling me not to strain myself. Sarah offered a sweet, melodic goodnight. I grabbed the half-empty trash bag from the kitchen and stepped out the back door into the cool, crisp night air. The darkness of the backyard offered a brief, desperately needed sanctuary from their suffocating presence. I walked down the stone path toward the large plastic bins resting near the alleyway. As I lifted the heavy lid of the recycling bin, a stray gust of wind caught a pile of shredded paper resting near the top, scattering several torn pieces onto the damp grass. I bent down to pick them up, intending to throw them back inside, but the bold red ink printed on the fragmented paper caught my eye. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and shone the narrow beam directly onto the torn documents. I recognized the distinctive, embossed logo of the prestigious investment firm where David supposedly worked as a highly successful executive. I knelt on the cold ground, my hands moving quickly to piece the jagged edges together like a morbid jigsaw puzzle. The reconstructed text was no glowing portfolio report. It was a severe final warning notice regarding massively overdrawn accounts. I sifted frantically through the recycling bin, pulling out more torn statements and collection letters. The financial reality of my son's life was laid bare in front of me. David's booming career was a complete and utter fabrication. He was not a successful investment banker riding the high wave of the corporate market. I was completely drowning in catastrophic debt. The numbers printed on the warnings were staggering, indicating massive unpaid liabilities. My son had exhausted every legal avenue of credit available to him. He was out of time and desperate for cash to save himself from ruin. The $5 million life insurance policy on my life was his only remaining lifeline. He needed me dead, and he needed it to happen immediately. The morning sun cast a cold light over the manicured lawns, illuminating the false perfection of the street outside. I sat on my bed, staring at my reflection with quiet intensity. For a year, I had looked at myself and seen nothing but a broken old man, a fragile widower waiting for his time to run out. But the reflection staring back at me today was different. The profound grief that had anchored me to the floor since Martha passed away was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating clarity. I am a structural engineer. I spent 4 decades analyzing massive concrete pillars, suspension cables, and foundational blueprints for the city. When a bridge is on the verge of collapsing, you do not sit down and weep. You examine the stress fractures. You calculate the load capacity. You identify exactly where the sabotage occurred and fortify your position. I buttoned my shirt, slipped the vial of laced tea into my left pocket, and safely secured the cardiac medication into my right. I walked downstairs with a deliberately unsteady shuffle, playing my part to absolute perfection. The kitchen was flooded with bright morning sunlight, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness I had just crawled out of. I paused at the threshold, forcing my facial muscles to slacken, adopting a vacant, slightly bewildered expression. Sarah was at the stove humming a cheerful, mindless pop tune as she flipped organic eggs in a copper skillet. David sat at the marble island, his eyes glued to his tablet, frantically scrolling through what I now knew were desperate financial ledgers, though he masked them as morning market reports. I shuffled toward the cabinets, my hands trembling with a perfectly calibrated artificial weakness. I opened the wrong door, staring blankly at the stacks of canned soup instead of the coffee mugs. "Looking for these, Dad?" Sarah asked, her voice dripping with that sickening, patronizing sweetness as she handed me a ceramic mug. "You've been so forgetful lately. Maybe we need to schedule another doctor's appointment, just to be safe." I took the mug with both hands, nodding meekly, offering a confused, apologetic smile. Inside, my blood was boiling at a catastrophic temperature. I wanted to smash the ceramic against the marble counter. I wanted to grab my son by his tailored collar and demand to know how much his soul was worth. But I simply poured my black coffee, letting my hand shake just enough to spill a few drops on the pristine countertop. My engineering mind compartmentalized the burning rage, locking it behind a firewall of pure logic. David didn't even look up, merely clicking his tongue in mild annoyance. "Careful, Dad. We just had those polished," he muttered, swiping his screen. The absolute lack of empathy, the casual dismissal of my fabricated frailty, cemented my resolve. They didn't see a father. They saw an expiring asset, a structural liability waiting to be demolished. I wiped the spill with a paper towel, moving with agonizing slowness, committing every arrogant smirk, every patronizing sigh to my memory. I told them I was driving down to the hardware store to buy sealant for the moldy drywall in the sewing room. David barely glanced up from his glowing screen, nodding and telling me to drive carefully because my reflexes had been getting slow lately. The sheer audacity of his fake concern almost made me smile. I shuffled out the front door, climbed into my old truck, and drove out. I did not go to the local hardware store. I drove past the town limits, merging onto the interstate, and heading 3 towns over to an independent biomedical testing laboratory I researched earlier. I needed answers from a place disconnected from our local community. A place where David and Sarah could not possibly have eyes or influence over the staff. The drive took 40 minutes, giving my mind ample time to process the chilling reality of my situation. I thought about how methodically they had laid the groundwork for my demise. Sarah bringing me that sweet-smelling tea every single night, watching me drink it with a gentle smile while adjusting my blanket. David casually mentioning to our friendly neighbors that I was becoming forgetful, planting the deceptive seeds of a dementia diagnosis in the minds of everyone who knew us. They were building a twisted narrative piece by piece, just like constructing a skyscraper from the ground up. First, you establish the foundation, which was my failing mental and physical health. Then you erect the sturdy framework, which was the isolation from my friends and the signing of the $5 million insurance policy. Finally, you execute the controlled demolition. I parked my truck in the dusty lot of the independent diagnostic clinic. It was a modest brick building tucked between a commercial bakery and a discount auto parts shop. I walked inside and approached the front counter. I requested an urgent private toxicology analysis. The receptionist informed me that expedited testing would be extremely expensive. I pulled a thick wad of cash from my wallet and paid the rush fee up front, ensuring no paper trail would lead back to my bank accounts. I was directed to the brightly lit consultation room, where I met with a senior toxicologist named Dr. Sterling. I placed the small vial of leftover tea and the tightly sealed box of cardiac medication onto his stainless steel table. I told him I needed to know exactly what chemical compounds were hidden in both containers, and I needed to know before the sun went down. Dr. Sterling looked at my grim expression, nodded professionally, and took the samples into the back laboratory. The next 3 hours sitting in that sterile waiting room felt like wading through freezing water. I drank stale coffee from a humming vending machine, running through every scenario in my tired head. I thought about my beautiful Martha. I thought about her gentle laugh and the tender way she always defended David, choosing to see the absolute best in our only son, even when he showed us his absolute worst. My chest tightened painfully, not from any artificial medication, but from the unbearable realization that her unconditional maternal love was likely the very thing that had gotten her killed. The harsh fluorescent lights of the clinic waiting room hummed with a maddening, relentless frequency that bored into my skull. I stared blankly at the peeling beige wallpaper, listening to the muffled sounds of medical equipment in the hallway, as my mind drifted back to a bitterly cold Christmas Eve, nearly 15 years ago. David had come home from business school with a fabricated, tearful story about a stolen laptop and an emptied bank account, begging for emergency tuition money. I had been furious, ready to demand a police report and solid proof. But Martha, with her infinite reservoir of grace, had simply pulled him into a warm, forgiving embrace. I remembered the exact look on her face, a fierce, protective maternal instinct that completely blinded her to the calculating, manipulative gleam in his eyes. She had quietly written him a massive check from her own modest savings the very next morning, whispering to me that the world was hard enough and our home should always be his safe harbor. She genuinely believed that love could cure any flaw. She believed that if she just poured enough kindness and understanding into our son, it would eventually wash away his deep-seated selfishness. That beautiful, naive faith had been her fatal weakness. Sitting in this sterile plastic chair, smelling the sharp, chemical scent of clinical bleach, the sheer magnitude of his betrayal threatened to crush my ribs. He hadn't just taken her life. He had weaponized her greatest virtue against her. He had used her endless forgiveness as a smokescreen while he ruthlessly drained her charity accounts. And when she finally saw the horrifying truth, he silenced her with a soothing cup of tea and a gentle kiss goodnight. The pure, unadulterated evil required to watch your own mother's heart stop beating, knowing you were the one who poisoned her, was entirely beyond my human comprehension. I squeezed my eyes shut, a single hot tear escaping and tracking slowly down my weathered cheek. I wiped it away aggressively. It was the last tear I would ever shed for my son. The agonizing sorrow was rapidly burning away, leaving behind a cold, hard expanse of tactical resolve. I would not let her death be a convenient stepping stone for his wealth. I would turn his bloody inheritance into an inescapable cage. Finally, the heavy wooden door squeaked open, and Dr. Sterling walked back into the consultation room. His calm, professional demeanor had completely vanished. He looked visibly disturbed, holding a printed chemical readout in his trembling hands. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, took a shaky breath, and asked me where on earth I had obtained these dangerous samples. I told him to skip the questions and just read me the scientific results. He looked down at his detailed paperwork. He confirmed that the herbal tea was heavily saturated with a potent pharmaceutical-grade sedative. He explained that taking this specific compound nightly would undoubtedly cause severe memory loss, extreme dizziness, chronic mental fatigue, and erratic heart palpitations. It was a calculated chemical cocktail designed to perfectly mimic the rapid onset of aggressive dementia. I absorbed the horrific information without breaking eye contact for a second. I slowly asked him about the pills resting in the cardboard box. Dr. Sterling swallowed hard, his wide eyes reflecting a deep, genuine horror. He explicitly told me the pills were absolutely not standard heart medication. They contained a highly concentrated lethal dosage of a synthetic cardiac stimulant. He explained that if a healthy man of my age ingested even a single one of those small pills, it would immediately trigger a massive catastrophic myocardial infarction. It would violently force the human heart to beat at an impossible rate until the muscle simply tore itself apart from the inside out. Furthermore, he explicitly warned that the specific chemical composition was cleverly designed to dissipate rapidly in the human bloodstream. Within a few hours of death, the deadly substance would be virtually untraceable in a standard suburban autopsy. The local county coroner would look at my medically documented history of recent dizzy spells and heart palpitations, which were actually caused by the poisoned tea, look at my advanced age and confidently rule my death as an entirely natural occurrence. I thanked Dr. Sterling for his time, took the written report from his desk, and walked out of the quiet clinic into the blinding afternoon sunlight. The cold, mechanical reality of their entire sinister plot finally settled over me like a heavy iron shroud. The forged property deeds, the massive insurance policy, the nightly laced tea, the lethal heart pills. I realized I was being actively, methodically poisoned to justify a fake dementia diagnosis, paving the perfect frictionless way for a completely natural-looking death so my only son could cash out a $5 million bounty on my life. The drive back to my quiet suburban neighborhood felt entirely different than the frantic journey I had taken just a few hours earlier. The blinding afternoon sunlight beating down on the windshield offered absolutely no warmth to my freezing skin. I gripped the steering wheel with a calm, terrifying certainty. The horrifying truth I had uncovered at the diagnostic clinic fundamentally altered the structural reality of my entire existence. I was not a fragile, grieving widower slowly losing his mind to the cruel ravages of dementia. I was a highly lucid, calculating engineer who had just discovered the meticulously placed explosive charges set to demolish his life. I pulled my truck into the driveway and parked carefully. The house was completely empty. David's expensive imported sports car was gone, and Sarah's sleek real estate vehicle was nowhere to be seen. They were likely out in the city, eagerly spending money they did not have, fully confident that the old man was safe at home drinking his poisoned tea and fading quietly into oblivion. I unlocked the front door and walked directly down the hallway. I did not hesitate. I stepped right back into Martha's sewing room, ignoring the massive jagged hole in the drywall where the rusted safe still hung open. My focus was now entirely fixed on the opposite corner of the room. Sitting against the floral wallpaper was Martha's antique wooden writing desk. Martha had purchased that cherry wood desk at a local estate sale nearly 2 decades ago. It was her private sanctuary within a sanctuary. She used it to organize her community charity events, write her elegant thank you notes, and balance her personal checkbook. I walked over and ran my rough fingertips along the polished wooden surface. I remembered a passing detail from the chaotic weeks following her sudden death. David had spent an unusual amount of time hovering around this specific desk, claiming he was searching for her final charity tax receipts to help close out her estate. I knelt down on the carpet and examined the heavy bottom right drawer. It was firmly secured with a brass lock. Martha always kept it locked playfully, telling me that a woman needed a place to keep her boring administrative secrets. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small flathead screwdriver I had grabbed from my truck. I did not care about preserving the antique wood anymore. I wedged the steel tip deep into the tight gap between the drawer and the desk frame. I applied a steady, calculated pressure, leveraging my body weight, until the brass locking mechanism violently snapped with a loud crack. I pulled the heavy drawer open. The scent of her floral perfume drifted up instantly, breaking my heart all over again. Inside, resting beneath a neat stack of old utility bills and vintage stationery, was a thick, dark green leather journal. I carefully lifted the journal from the drawer and carried it over to the small reading chair near the window. I sat down heavily, the leather creaking beneath my weight. I opened the cover. The pages were filled with Martha's elegant, flowing, cursive handwriting. I began to read through the entries from the final months of her life. At first, the pages were filled with mundane details about her garden, her weekly baking recipes, and her worries about my looming retirement. But as I flipped forward, approaching the dates leading up to her tragic death, the tone of her writing shifted dramatically. The ink pressed harder into the paper. The elegant cursive became jagged and frantic. Martha had served as the lead treasurer for our local community food bank for over 15 years. She took immense pride in balancing their modest ledgers. 3 weeks before she died, she noted a series of bizarre financial discrepancies. Large, unexplained withdrawals were draining the charity accounts. She wrote that she spent 4 sleepless nights tracing the digital routing numbers, trying to understand where the critical funds were disappearing to. Then I turned the page and saw my son's name written in bold, underlined strokes. Martha had discovered the horrifying truth. David was using his professional investment credentials to systematically embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from her community charity. He was secretly siphoning the funds to cover his own mounting debts. My hands began to tremble as I read her devastated words. She wrote about the profound, shattering agony of realizing her only child was a common thief. She detailed how she had quietly gathered all the banking evidence determined to force him to return the stolen money before the charity board ordered a formal financial audit. I turned to the very last page in the green leather journal. The date written at the top was the exact day before the morning I found her lifeless body in our bed. The handwriting on this final page was incredibly shaky, lacking her usual graceful loops. She wrote that she had confronted David in our kitchen that afternoon while I was out meeting with my engineering colleagues. She demanded he repay the charity, immediately threatening to expose his devastating crimes to the police if he refused. She noted that David broke down crying hysterically on the kitchen tiles and begging for her maternal mercy. He promised her he would transfer the stolen funds back the very next morning. I read the final chilling paragraph 3 times, my vision blurring with hot, stinging tears. The words burned themselves permanently into my mind. Martha wrote that David returned to the house later that evening to deeply apologize. She noted that he brought her a warm, soothing cup of herbal tea to help calm her anxious nerves. The very last sentence she ever wrote was a terrifying, innocent observation. She wrote that her chest felt strangely tight, and she was going to lay down early to rest her tired heart. I slowly closed the heavy leather cover of the journal, the muted thud echoing in the silence of the room. The air in the house suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the atmosphere. I looked down at the dark green book resting in my trembling hands. The entire horrifying mosaic of the past year assembled itself in my mind with brutal, undeniable clarity. David had not merely insured my life for a massive financial payout, nor had he simply decided to slowly poison me to solve his crushing corporate debts. He had already successfully tested his lethal, untraceable methods right here in this very house. When his own mother uncovered his massive financial crimes and threatened to expose his embezzlement, he did not hesitate to eliminate the biggest threat to his comfortable survival. The sweet, herbal tea Sarah had been feeding me every single night was the exact same soothing blend my son had lovingly prepared for his mother on the very last night of her life. My wife did not die of a tragic natural heart failure in the quiet comfort of our shared bedroom. My beautiful forgiving. Martha was brutally and calculatingly murdered by the very son she had spent her entire life trying to protect. Sitting in my truck, the weight of reality settled into my bones like concrete. The paralyzing grip of grief was replaced by cold determination. I was an engineer. I knew how to dismantle a compromised structure without bringing it down on my head, and I knew how to build a trap. I drove back to my quiet neighborhood and parked in the driveway. As I walked through the door, David was sitting in the living room casually sipping expensive bourbon while watching a golf tournament on television. Sarah was upstairs, likely browsing designer catalogs. Leaning heavily on the doorframe, I let out a weary sigh. I told my son my mind felt incredibly foggy lately, and the suffocating weight of this house was becoming too much to bear. I pitched my voice perfectly, letting it crack with manufactured vulnerability. I told him I needed to get away to clear my head and had decided to rent an off-the-grid fishing cabin up in the remote woods of Wisconsin for 3 days. David muted the television instantly. He stood up, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed excitement, and placed a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder. He told me a quiet retreat was an absolutely brilliant idea. He agreed that fresh air and total isolation would do wonders for my deteriorating mental state. Within 10 minutes, my son was practically packing my bags for me. He carried my canvas duffel bag to the truck, cheerfully reminding me to leave my cell phone turned off so I could truly disconnect and find peace. He stood in the driveway waving goodbye with a warm smile as I backed into the street. He looked like a devoted son sending his aging father on a healing vacation. In reality, he was celebrating an empty house. He believed he had 3 uninterrupted days to finalize his lethal preparations. I drove north for 20 miles, ensuring my truck was completely out of our local area, then took a sharp exit and pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a dilapidated roadside motel. It was a miserable, forgotten place with flickering neon signs and peeling paint. It was exactly the invisible sanctuary I needed. I parked behind a row of overgrown bushes, grabbed my duffel bag, and walked into room 12. Sitting at the wobbly wooden table near the window was a man named Bradley Mitchell. Bradley was a former forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We crossed paths 2 decades ago when I was working as a lead structural consultant on a massive downtown bridge project. He was assigned to investigate a complex web of contractor fraud tied to construction materials. I helped him decode the structural blueprints, and in return, he showed me how ruthlessly money moves through the darkest corners of the corporate world. I called him from a secure payphone immediately after leaving the clinic, calling in a favor he owed me for 20 years. Bradley offered no empty condolences. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pointed to 3 glowing laptop screens set up on the cramped table. Sitting on the squeaking mattress, I handed him the forged property deed and the life insurance policy recovered from the flooded safe. I told him I needed to know exactly how deep the financial rot in my son's life went and who was pulling his strings. Bradley cracked his knuckles and went to work. For the next 8 agonizing hours, the dingy motel room was filled with the rapid clatter of his mechanical keyboard. I sat in silence, watching his eyes dart across the screens as he aggressively bypassed corporate firewalls, traced encrypted routing numbers, and dug through the carefully hidden layers of David's supposedly successful investment firm. As the sun set and the room grew dark, the horrifying picture of my son's secret life rendered itself in agonizing detail. Bradley let out a low whistle that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He turned his monitor toward me. He explained that David's investment career had spectacularly imploded over 3 years ago due to massive reckless gambling on volatile tech stocks. To maintain his lavish lifestyle and Sarah's appetite for high-end real estate, David started desperately borrowing money. When legitimate banks cut him off, he turned to highly illegal sources. Bradley traced a series of untraceable wire transfers originating from a guarded offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He pulled up a hidden digital ledger David had foolishly tried to encrypt on a private server. My son did not just owe money to angry credit card companies. He was currently in debt for an unbelievable $4 million to a highly organized, violently dangerous underground syndicate operating out of the city. Bradley explained these were absolutely not men who sent collection letters or filed civil lawsuits. These were ruthless men who shattered kneecaps and made people permanently disappear when debts were ignored. David had been desperately shuffling stolen funds to keep them at bay, which perfectly explained the money he callously embezzled from my late wife's community charity last year. But that small theft only bought him a brief reprieve. The syndicate had clearly lost their patience with his empty promises. Bradley's fingers paused over the keyboard, his face bathed in the sickly blue light of the monitors. The stale, nicotine-stained walls of the motel room seemed to close in on us as he pulled up a heavily encrypted subfolder. "You need to understand exactly who your son got into bed with, Thomas," Bradley whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual clinical detachment. He clicked a generic-looking audio file. It wasn't a standard collection call. It was an intercepted voicemail from a burner phone left for David just 3 days ago. The voice that echoed through the cheap laptop speakers was terrifyingly calm. A low, raspy baritone that spoke with the casual cadence of a man discussing the weather. "David, this is your final courtesy update. The bridge loan has matured. We know about the Chicago property. We know about the life insurance. If the account isn't settled by Friday morning, we aren't just taking the house. We are going to make an example out of you that your country club friends will read about in the obituaries. Clock is ticking, kid." Bradley closed the audio file and immediately brought up a series of surveillance photographs extracted from a dark web ledger. They showed a different man, a wealthy local real estate developer I vaguely recognized from the local news. The first photo showed him smiling at a charity gala. The second photo, taken by the syndicate as a proof of concept for their debtors, showed the same man kneeling in an abandoned warehouse, his face beaten beyond all human recognition, his expensive suit soaked in dark blood. He had owed the syndicate less than half of what David currently owed. I stared at the gruesome image, the bile rising hot and bitter in the back of my throat. My son was not just a greedy corporate failure. He was a dead man walking. He had dragged the most violent, unforgiving elements of the criminal underworld directly to my doorstep. He had wagered my life and Martha's life in a desperate, pathetic attempt to shield himself from the absolute monsters he had foolishly chosen to do business with. The sheer scale of his reckless stupidity was almost as staggering as his malice. Bradley clicked another button, bringing up a heavily redacted financial document. He leaned back in his chair, his face completely pale in the blue light of the monitor. He told me that things were actually much worse than the life insurance policy. David had recently taken out an illegal high-interest bridge loan directly from the syndicate, using the forged property deed of my home as the primary collateral. He had literally gambled the roof over my head to secure a final, desperate extension on his life. Bradley pointed to the specific repayment terms highlighted in red ink at the bottom of the digital ledger. The massive ballooning payment was due in full by the end of this current week. The cold, terrifying reality of the situation locked my jaw. David had insured my life for $5 million because he needed $4 million to pay off a ruthless criminal enterprise, and another $1 million to secure his own escape. The syndicate did not care about his corporate title or his tailored suits. They had given him a hard, unforgiving deadline. Bradley looked at me with a grim, chilling certainty. He told me that if my son did not deliver that enormous sum of cash by this coming Friday, the syndicate was going to kill him. David was entirely out of time, out of options, and out of money. He was a cornered, desperate animal. That was the exact reason he was accelerating my mental decline with the sedatives. That was why Sarah was brewing the poisoned tea with such frantic consistency. They were completely out of time. If I did not die of a tragic, natural-looking heart attack, by Friday morning my son would be murdered by his own creditors. I sat in that dark motel room, staring at the digital countdown of my own assassination. Realizing I had less than 72 hours to strike back, I was going to crush his entire world piece by piece. The digital clock on the motel nightstand flashed midnight. My execution was scheduled for Friday. It was Wednesday. I had 48 hours to dismantle my son. Watching Bradley pack his equipment, we exchanged no words. My engineering mind had fully taken over, replacing heartbreak with a cold focus. I told Bradley we needed to move immediately. The neighborhood would be asleep and my house empty. I knew every wooden stud, electrical conduit, and ventilation shaft in that property because I personally reinforced them 30 years ago. We left the motel and drove my truck with dimmed headlights down my quiet street. I parked 2 blocks away behind thick bushes, ensuring my vehicle remained hidden. The night air was freezing, biting through my jacket, but the adrenaline surging through my veins kept my hands steady. We walked silently through the back alleys, moving like ghosts through the neighborhood I had lived in for decades. I used my original brass key to unlock the heavy wooden back door. The house was pitch black and perfectly still. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with secrets. I led Bradley directly into the main living room, communicating with silent hand gestures. He opened his bag and handed me 4 microscopic camera lenses, each no larger than a shirt button. They were incredibly advanced technology, equipped with high-definition night vision and sensitive audio receivers. Bradley explained they needed to be hardwired directly into the electrical grid to avoid using unstable wireless batteries that could fail. He handed me a spool of ultra-thin copper wire. This was where my decades of architectural expertise became my weapon. I pulled a stepladder from the closet and went to work. Every screw I removed from the aluminum vent grates felt like pulling a tooth. As I threaded the ultra-thin copper wiring through the dark, dusty ductwork, my muscle memory took over completely. I didn't need a flashlight to know exactly where the load-bearing beams intersected or where the electrical conduits branched off toward the breaker box. I had designed this internal nervous system myself. I vividly remembered a sweltering July afternoon 32 years ago, standing on this exact stepladder, covered in white drywall dust, while Martha sat on a paint bucket below me, handing me tools and laughing at my terrible jokes. We had built this sanctuary piece by piece, infusing every single square inch of the timber and plaster with our shared dreams. Now I was moving through the shadows of my own home like a covert saboteur, dissecting the very walls we had built with so much love. I was converting my beautiful, peaceful suburban fortress into a high-tech federal mousetrap. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I carefully sliced into the thick rubber insulation of the primary electrical wire, twisting the microscopic camera leads into the live current. A tiny invisible blue spark signaled the connection was successful. I wrapped the splice tightly in black electrical tape, burying the evidence deep behind the drywall. I was no longer the loving patriarch of this household. I was the demolition expert, and I was methodically planting the digital explosive charges that would ultimately bring the entire Bennett family legacy crashing down into the dust. I started in the kitchen. I removed the plastic grating of the heating vent above the island. I drilled a microscopic hole through the metal louver, threading the lens through until it was invisible in the shadows. I ran the copper wiring backward along the internal ductwork, expertly bypassing the fan blades and routing the connection straight up toward the ceiling. I moved with a practiced, highly methodical rhythm, ignoring the painful stiffness in my joints. I installed the second camera inside the hollow casing of the smoke detector in the main hallway, positioning the tiny glass eye to capture a clear view of the front door and the wooden staircase. I placed the third camera directly inside the glass chandelier hanging in the dining room, the exact room where my son had smiled and lied to my face hours earlier. The final location was the master bedroom. It was the room I had shared with Martha for 40 years, the room where she took her last breath. Stepping into that space felt like walking into a frozen tomb, but I forced the emotion down into the darkest corner of my mind. I set up the ladder beneath the primary ceiling vent, located directly above the large oak bed. I installed the final microscopic lens, angling it downward to cover the entire floor plan. I gathered the trailing ends of all 4 copper wires and told Bradley it was time to move into the attic to connect the surveillance hub. We pulled down the creaking wooden access stairs hidden in the hallway ceiling and climbed into the oppressive darkness of the attic. The air up there was thick with ancient dust and the sharp scent of dry fiberglass insulation. The physical toll of the night was beginning to catch up with my body. My knees ached terribly from climbing the ladder, and my lower back burned with a dull, persistent pain. I gritted my teeth and crawled across the exposed joists, carrying the bundled wires toward the central electrical junction box. Bradley followed closely behind, setting up a compact digital recording server that would transmit the encrypted video footage back to his laptop at the motel. We sat in the suffocating darkness of the attic, surrounded by the exposed wooden ribs of my home, stripping the copper wires and splicing them into the main power grid. Bradley configured the software, whispering that the network was establishing a secure connection. The entire house was now rigged to capture every single word, every movement, and every sinister action my son and his wife planned to make. We were tying off the final layer of electrical tape when a sudden flash of bright yellow light cut through the small ventilation louver at the front of the attic. I froze instantly, my heart slamming against my ribs. The low rumble of a heavy engine echoed from the street outside. I crawled silently over the fiberglass insulation, pressing my eye against the narrow wooden slats of the attic vent. A sleek, dark luxury car had just pulled smoothly into my driveway. The headlights shut off, plunging the yard back into darkness. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was David and Sarah. They had returned to the house in the dead of night to execute the next phase of their plan. Panic surged through my chest like a bolt of lightning. We were trapped. The only way out of the attic was the pull-down wooden staircase resting directly in the middle of the second-floor hallway. If we tried to leave, we would be caught instantly. Bradley looked at me, his eyes wide with silent alarm in the dark. I held my finger up to my lips, signaling for absolute, breathless silence. We both heard the heavy metallic click of the solid front door unlocking directly below us. The hinges groaned loudly in the quiet house. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly on the polished hardwood floor of the main entryway. I could hear Sarah whispering something in a sharp, urgent tone, followed by David's low, muffled response. Their voices drifted up through the floorboards, carrying a tense, vibrating energy. I gestured for Bradley to follow me. We crawled backward, moving inch by agonizing inch over the wooden joists, terrified that a single creaking board would give us away. We wedged ourselves tightly into the narrow, claustrophobic crawl space located directly above the master bedroom ceiling. The insulated space was incredibly tight, forcing us to lie completely flat on our stomachs against the rough, scratchy drywall. The dust burned my nostrils. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, just to suppress a desperate urge to cough. We heard the heavy footsteps moving up the main wooden staircase. They were getting closer, the sound vibrating directly into my bones. The bedroom door below us creaked open. Suddenly, the bright glare of the overhead bedroom lights snapped on, illuminating the thin cracks in the floorboards, right beneath my face. I held my breath, my aging lungs burning fiercely for precious oxygen, as I watched my only son walk slowly into the room, directly below me, completely unaware of the absolute ruin hanging just inches above his head. My only son moved across the master bedroom with an incredibly eerie, practiced confidence. Through the narrow metal slats of the ventilation grate, I watched him walk directly toward the vintage mahogany desk resting quietly in the far corner of the room. The heavy, oppressive heat of the cramped attic crawlspace pressed down firmly on my chest, making every shallow breath feel exactly like inhaling dry sand. Bradley lay perfectly still right beside me, the faint, bluish glow of his tactical tablet illuminating his tense, focused features. We were suspended, just inches above the cruel man who had orchestrated the absolute destruction of my life, acting as silent witnesses to his final act of treason. David did not hesitate for a second. He reached out and pressed the power button on my personal computer. I watched the screen flicker to life, casting a harsh white glare across his sharp facial features. For a brief, naive moment, I wondered how he intended to bypass the complex alphanumeric passwords I had established after Martha died. I am a retired engineer, and my digital security was not something easily dismantled. But David did not try to guess my passwords. He simply reached behind the computer tower, his fingers swiftly tracing the cables until he found a small, dark USB device plugged into the primary port. He had installed a hardware keylogger. He had been quietly recording every single keystroke, every private password, and every secure banking credential I had typed for the past 12 months. He pulled a small leather notebook from his tailored jacket, flipped to a marked page, and began typing with ruthless efficiency. I felt a cold, paralyzing knot form in my stomach as I watched the familiar interface of my primary retirement account load onto the screen. This was the account where I kept my most liquid assets, the financial safety net I had painstakingly built over 4 decades of grueling construction projects and endless overtime shifts. It was the money meant to guarantee my independence in my twilight years. David navigated to the wire transfer portal. He did not pause to read the balance. He already knew exactly how much was left. He typed in a routing number I did not recognize, followed by the total available balance. $200,000. It was the very last of my liquid cash. He hovered his finger over the confirmation key. I stared down through the metal grate, silently praying for a single moment of hesitation, a microscopic flicker of guilt to cross his face. There was nothing. His expression remained entirely blank, focused only on his own desperate survival. He pressed the key. A green confirmation banner flashed across the screen. In a matter of seconds, my son had wiped out the final remnants of my life savings, stealing the very last dollar to his name to feed his catastrophic debts. Beside me, Bradley gently tapped my shoulder. He pointed a steady finger at the glowing screen of his tactical tablet. He had successfully routed the live feeds from the invisible micro-cameras we had just installed downstairs. The screen was split into multiple high-definition angles, but Bradley had expanded the feed from the kitchen vent. The image was crystal clear in the stark fluorescent lighting of the room below. Sarah was standing at the sleek marble island in the center of the kitchen. She was dressed in an expensive designer trench coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled, looking as though she had just returned from a high society gala. But her actions were anything but glamorous. She placed a small velvet-lined jewelry box onto the marble counter. She opened the lid and pulled out a sterile medical syringe, followed by one of the small glass vials of the lethal cardiac stimulant we had discovered hidden inside the rusted safe. My breath caught in my throat. I watched the digital screen with mounting horror as my daughter-in-law moved toward the stainless steel refrigerator. She opened the heavy door and reached into the bottom crisper drawer. She pulled out the small insulated medical pouch where I kept my daily insulin pens. I am a borderline diabetic, and I rely on those carefully measured doses every single morning to regulate my blood sugar. It is a strict, unavoidable routine. Sarah placed the insulin pens onto the counter next to the syringe. She moved with a terrifying, practiced grace, completely devoid of any hesitation or moral conflict. She carefully inserted the needle into the glass vial, drawing back the plunger to extract a precise measure of the deadly, untraceable cardiac poison. I watched the clear liquid fill the plastic cylinder. She then took one of my daily insulin pens, removed the protective cap, and skillfully injected the lethal stimulant directly into the medicinal cartridge. She repeated this sickening process 3 times systematically, contaminating my entire week's supply of life-saving medication. The sheer brilliance and absolute cruelty of their plan left me completely paralyzed. If I drank the poisoned tea, my heart would fail, but the autopsy would find the sedative. But if I injected the poison myself, completely unaware of the contamination, it would look like a tragic, unpreventable medical catastrophe. The coroner would see a diabetic old man with a documented history of recent dizzy spells and heart palpitations, who simply suffered a massive, fatal heart attack during his normal morning routine. There would be absolutely no suspicion of foul play. The insurance company would pay out the $5 million policy without a single question, and my son would walk away a wealthy, innocent man. Down below. David closed my laptop and walked out of the master bedroom, plunging the room back into darkness. On the tablet screen, I watched him enter the bright kitchen and stand beside his wife. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, running his hands over his face. He told her that the transfer was finally complete, and the angry syndicate would be temporarily pacified, but they desperately needed the life insurance payout by Friday morning to secure their permanent freedom. Sarah did not look up from her grim task. She calmly capped the final insulin pen, wiped the counter with a damp cloth, and placed the contaminated medication back into the refrigerator drawer. She turned to her husband, her face completely calm, devoid of any stress or anxiety. She leaned against the marble island, crossing her arms comfortably, and actually smiled. Her voice carried perfectly through the hidden microphone, crisp and clear, in our dark attic sanctuary. She told David to relax, assuring him that everything was perfectly handled. She said the old man would be gone by tomorrow morning, and their financial nightmares would finally be over. Then she let out a soft, melodious laugh that chilled me to the very core of my soul. She looked at the man who had just ruthlessly stolen his father's life savings, the man who had already murdered his own mother, and casually asked him if he honestly thought a slate gray or a midnight black Porsche would look better parked in the driveway of their new Malibu beach house. Down in the kitchen, David let out a low, nervous chuckle, pouring himself a generous splash of the expensive bourbon. He took a long sip, his eyes scanning the dark hallway. "You don't think he suspects anything, do you?" he asked, a sudden tremor of paranoia bleeding into his voice. He was asking a lot of weird questions about the insurance envelope today. What if his mind isn't as far gone as the doctors think? What if he decides he doesn't want the wine tomorrow night? Sarah sighed loudly, a sound of profound, irritated exhaustion. Through the microscopic lens, I watched her walk over to him, gently taking the crystal bourbon glass from his trembling hand. She took a slow sip, leaving a faint smudge of red lipstick on the rim, and looked up at him with eyes devoid of any human warmth. "David, you need to pull yourself together. We are 24 hours away from the finish line. The old fool is completely senile. He barely remembered his own fishing trip this afternoon." She reached out, her pale fingers smoothing the lapel of his expensive jacket. "But to answer your question, if he refuses to drink the wine, or if he gets fussy like a stubborn child, then we will simply stop playing the gentle caretakers." My blood ran freezing cold in the attic dust. Sarah's voice had dropped to a casual conversational tone, as if she were discussing what to order for lunch. "If he won't drink it, I will hold his arms down and you will force it down his throat. And if he struggles and makes a mess, we will just push him down the steep basement stairs and tell the paramedics he had a dizzy spell and took a terrible fall. A broken neck pays out the exact same life insurance premium as a heart attack, David. I am not letting those syndicate thugs take everything I've built just because your father decides to be difficult." The sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness of her backup plan left me entirely breathless. I had always assumed David was the primary architect of this nightmare, but as I watched her casually outline my violent murder while sipping my expensive bourbon, I realized I had gravely underestimated Sarah. She wasn't just a willing accomplice. She was the steel spine keeping my weak, desperate son moving forward. We lay paralyzed in the suffocating darkness for 3 agonizing hours. Thick dust coated my lung, but I forced my breathing into a shallow rhythm. Down below, my son and his wife finally turned off the bright kitchen lights and moved into the guest bedroom, closing the door behind them. I waited another full hour, listening until the muffled sound of their breathing signaled they were asleep. I tapped Bradley on the shoulder. Moving with excruciating slowness, we backed out of the crawl space. Every shift of my weight on the wooden joists felt like navigating a minefield. The physical toll on my 70-year-old body was immense, my knees throbbing with a sharp ache, but the pure adrenaline of survival pushed the pain aside. We quietly lowered the attic stairs, placing our feet on the very edges of the treads to prevent creaking. We slipped down the hallway, past the closed door, and stepped out into the freezing pre-dawn air. The walk back to my hidden truck was a silent, hurried march. When we reached the vehicle, neither spoke. I drove us back to the dilapidated motel as purple sunlight began to bleed into the dark sky. The neon sign buzzed erratically above room 12 as we stepped inside, locking the deadbolt. Bradley sat at the wooden table and opened his laptop. He pulled up the encrypted feed from the local server we established in my attic. The high-definition footage securely backed up to his drives. I went into the bathroom, splashed freezing water onto my face, and stared at my reflection. I had just watched my son casually finalize my execution, treating my impending death like a minor hurdle on his path to buying a luxury car. I dried my face, poured 2 cups of terrible instant coffee, and sat next to Bradley. We began sorting through the audio and video files captured over the last few hours. The invisible micro cameras performed flawlessly, delivering clear visuals and sensitive sound. We watched the footage from the kitchen vent, observing the exact moments after Sarah had contaminated my insulin pens. David was pacing across the marble tiles, pouring himself another glass of expensive bourbon. The tension between them was palpable, vibrating through the screen. Sarah leaned against the island, crossing her arms tightly, her earlier amusement fading into a sharp annoyance. She complained bitterly about the massive delay in their financial rescue, reminding David that the underground syndicate was out of patience. She sneered at him, telling him that relying on the old man's declining health was a risk, and waiting for the poisoned tea to finally induce a heart attack was taking too long. David slammed his glass onto the marble countertop, the loud crack echoing sharply through the audio feed. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a trembling finger at his wife, his voice dropping into a vicious snarl. He asked her if she honestly thought he wanted to wait this long to collect the money. He paced aggressively across the kitchen floor, reminding her of the crushing $4 million debt hanging over his head, the violent threats they received from the syndicate, and the absolute necessity of making my death look completely natural to the coroner. Sarah rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly at his cautious methodology. She told him he was being a coward, that he should have simply doubled the sedative dose weeks ago and finished the job quickly. That was the exact moment my son's fragile composure completely shattered. He stopped pacing, leaning over the marble island until he was inches from her face. His voice escalated from an angry whisper into a sharp, terrifying bark that stripped away every remaining layer of his humanity. He told her she had absolutely no idea what it took to orchestrate a flawless medical anomaly. He snapped his words, carrying a chilling, lethal certainty. He screamed, asking her if she thought he wanted to wait. He explicitly stated he did not want to wait with his mother either, but it had to look exactly like a natural heart attack. He confessed, looking dead into the hidden camera's view, that he had swapped his mother's pills, and now he was going to swap his father's. He bragged the method worked perfectly the first time, and it would work perfectly again. The motel room fell silent. The audio recording hissed softly with static, but those horrific words hung in the air like a crushing physical weight. I stopped breathing entirely. The ceramic coffee mug slipped from my trembling hands, shattering into jagged pieces on the cheap linoleum floor, hot liquid splashing across my boots. I did not feel the heat. I did not feel anything at all. My analytical brain tried to process the sheer magnitude of what the microphone had captured, but my heart was completely torn apart. The terrible gut feeling that had been quietly eating away at my soul since I read Martha's hidden journal was now an undeniable fact. I had concrete, high-definition video evidence of my only child explicitly confessing to the premeditated first-degree murder of his own mother. Bradley slowly reached out and pressed the pause button on the laptop keyboard, freezing David's contorted, furious face on the glowing screen. The veteran investigator looked at me, his professional detachment completely fractured by the sheer evil we had just witnessed in that footage. He took a deep, shaky breath, his voice steady but carrying a heavy, urgent weight. He told me that we had the ultimate proof. We had the financial motive, the medical method, and a direct verbal confession securely captured on an encrypted federal server. He reached into his jacket pocket for his cell phone, telling me that the waiting was over and that we needed to call the local police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. He said they could have a tactical assault team swarming the house before David even woke up. I looked at the frozen image of the monster wearing my son's face. The paralyzing grief that anchored me to the ground for an entire year completely evaporated, instantly replaced by cold, calculating, absolute wrath. I am a structural engineer. When a building is utterly condemned, you do not board up the windows and walk away. You plant explosive charges at the exact foundational weak points and watch the entire corrupted structure implode. I reached across the small wooden table and placed my heavy hand firmly over Bradley's phone, slowly pushing it down against the wood. I looked the investigator dead in the eye, my voice devoid of warmth, fear, or paternal mercy. I told him no. I told him we were not going to call the police yet. I wanted to look my son in the eye when his entire world finally came crashing down. Bradley stared at me across the small wooden table in the dimly lit motel room, the weight of my demand hanging heavy in the stagnant air. He recognized the cold, uncompromising resolve in my eyes. I did not want a quiet arrest. I did not want my son to surrender peacefully to uniformed officers at a sterile corporate office. I needed him to face the absolute devastation of his actions in the very house he was trying to steal. Bradley slowly removed his hand from his phone and nodded. I understood that this was no longer just a criminal investigation. This was the final demolition of a corrupted legacy. He opened his laptop, initiated a secure, encrypted connection, and dialed a highly restricted federal number. He did not call the local police precinct. He called a specialized financial crimes task force operating out of the federal building downtown. He spoke in rapid, hushed tones, using clinical investigative terminology to describe the massive wire fraud, the forged property deeds, the syndicate debt, and the clear video evidence of a premeditated murder conspiracy. Within 2 hours, 3 unmarked black vehicles rolled quietly into the cracked asphalt parking lot of our forgotten roadside motel. 4 federal agents stepped into our cramped room, bringing an immediate sense of overwhelming authority. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man named Agent Harrison, introduced himself with a firm handshake. He did not offer any patronizing pity. He treated me with the direct, respectful professionalism of a man who dealt with the darkest corners of human greed every single day. Bradley connected his tactical tablet to a portable projector the agents had brought, casting the high-definition surveillance footage onto the blank motel wall. We sat in total silence as the federal team watched my son and his wife casually contaminate my life-saving medication. They watched Sarah inject the lethal cardiac stimulant into my insulin pens. They listened to the crystal-clear audio of David explicitly confessing to the premeditated murder of his own mother. The agents took meticulous notes, cross-referencing the video timestamps with the digital financial ledgers Bradley had extracted from the offshore servers. Agent Harrison let out a slow, measured breath when the video finally ended. He confirmed that the financial embezzlement and the forged property deeds were enough to secure a federal indictment for wire fraud and conspiracy. However, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, and introduced a deeply frustrating legal complication. Agent Harrison explained that while the video evidence of the insulin tampering was horrifying, expensive defense attorneys could attempt to manipulate the narrative in a courtroom. They could argue that the audio recording of David confessing to his mother's murder was merely a morbid, tasteless joke made during a stressful argument. They could claim that Sarah was simply transferring a legal over-the-counter supplement into the insulin pens as part of a misguided holistic health routine, without physical proof of the poison entering my system, or without catching them in the direct, undeniable act of attempting to administer the lethal dose. A slick corporate lawyer might introduce enough reasonable doubt to reduce their sentences. The syndicate debt complicated matters further. If the federal authorities arrested David prematurely, the underground criminal enterprise would instantly realize their $4 million loan was permanently lost. They would scatter, erasing their digital footprints and hiding their assets before the Bureau could launch a coordinated raid. The federal team needed to wrap a tight, inescapable net around both my son and the criminal organization pulling his strings. To achieve a flawless conviction, Agent Harrison looked me directly in the eyes and delivered a terrifying proposition. He told me they needed David and Sarah to actively cross the point of no return. The federal prosecutors needed undeniable proof that the couple had every intention of executing their lethal plan. They needed to catch them handing me the poison, fully believing that I was about to consume it. The agents proposed a highly orchestrated tactical sting operation. They would wire my clothing with microscopic audio transmitters and position an armed intervention team completely out of sight around the perimeter of my property. They would monitor every single movement through the hidden cameras we had already installed in the air vents. But for the trap to work flawlessly, I had to walk willingly into the jaws of the beast. I had to sit at my own dining table, look my murderous son in the eye, and play the role of the frail, unsuspecting victim one last time. I had to let them serve me the fatal dose. Agent Harrison walked me through the meticulous safety protocols they planned to implement. He assured me that a specialized medical unit would be stationed in an unmarked ambulance just 3 houses down the street. They would be carrying the exact chemical antidotes required to neutralize the cardiac stimulant and the heavy sedatives, just in case something went catastrophically wrong during the dinner. Agent Harrison motioned to a quiet woman sitting in the corner of the motel room, whom he introduced as Dr. Aris, the Bureau's lead tactical toxicologist. She stepped forward, her face grim, holding a digital tablet, displaying the chemical breakdown I had received from the independent clinic earlier that day. She did not sugarcoat the reality of what I was agreeing to. She explained that the synthetic cardiac stimulant David was using was a highly unstable black market derivative. It was specifically engineered to violently force the calcium channels in the human heart permanently open. If even a fraction of that laced wine made it down my throat and into my bloodstream, my heart rate would instantly spike to over 250 beats per minute. Dr. Aris looked me dead in the eye and explained that the human heart muscle simply cannot sustain that level of violent contraction. Within 90 seconds of ingestion, the organ would literally begin to tear its own tissue apart from the inside out, causing massive, irreversible internal hemorrhaging. The antidote we carry in the ambulance is a specialized, extremely heavy beta blocker combined with a rapid-acting chemical sedative. Dr. Aris explained, her voice steady but laced with a dire warning. But Thomas, you need to understand the margins we are working with here. If you accidentally swallow that poison, our tactical medical team has exactly 60 to 90 seconds to breach your front doors, physically, secure the room, and inject the counter-agent directly into your jugular vein. If we are delayed by a locked door, a tactical misstep, or if David attempts to fight our entry team, the antidote will not save you. You will die on your own dining room floor. The heavy silence in the motel room returned thicker and more oppressive than before. The federal agents watched my face closely, waiting to see if the terrifying medical reality would finally make the old man back down. But the fear they expected to see never materialized. I simply nodded, thanking the doctor for her absolute transparency. He handed me a small, discreet panic button disguised as an ordinary key fob, instructing me to keep it buried deep inside my left trouser pocket at all times. If I felt my son becoming physically aggressive, or if I believed Sarah was trying to force the laced liquid into my system before the signal was given, I only needed to press that button once. The entire federal team would breach the doors in less than 10 seconds. I took the heavy plastic device from his hands, feeling the cold, rigged edges pressing sharply against my calloused palm. I nodded slowly, fully comprehending the immense life-threatening risks involved in executing this highly dangerous federal sting operation. I was placing my 70-year-old life directly on the line. But after enduring months of suffocating grief and terrifying deception, I felt a strange, powerful sense of absolute clarity. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a web of corporate greed and familial betrayal. I was an angry father actively seeking ultimate justice for his murdered wife. I was a retired engineer deliberately tearing down a corrupted, rotting structure once and for all. The room fell completely silent, waiting for my response. I did not hesitate. I thought about my beautiful Martha, about the terrible betrayal she suffered in her final moments. I looked at Agent Harrison and agreed to be the bait. I told them I would deliver the perfect performance. We reviewed the calendar resting on the table. The syndicate deadline was fast approaching, meaning David was increasingly desperate. I pointed to the date marked for this coming Thursday. I told the agents that Thursday was my 71st birthday. David and Sarah had already insisted on cooking a special intimate dinner at the house to celebrate. It was the absolute perfect cover for a natural, unexpected tragedy. They would serve me the poisoned tea, along with my birthday cake, fully expecting me to die quietly in my sleep. The federal team immediately began drawing up the tactical blueprints for the raid. The stage was set. The explosive charges were planted. My son's entire world was going to end on Thursday night. The 48 hours leading up to the sting operation were the most excruciating of my life. Agent Harrison did not just leave me to my own devices. He transformed my mindset from that of a grieving widower into a highly disciplined undercover operative. We spent hours in that dingy motel room, running tactical simulations. Harrison played the role of David, aggressively questioning me, trying to break my fabricated facade of senility. He taught me how to control my micro-expressions, how to naturally deflect loaded questions, and most importantly, how to manage the massive adrenaline spike I would inevitably experience when the poisoned wine was finally poured. "Your body is going to scream at you to react," Harrison warned, pacing the worn carpet. "Your fight-or-flight response will be off the charts. You must anchor yourself. Find a physical focal point in the room, something neutral, and tether your mind to it." I chose the grandfather clock. On Wednesday evening, under the cover of a massive thunderstorm that drowned out the sound of their unmarked vehicles, the tactical team brought me back to the motel to fit the audio wire. It was not the bulky taped-on microphone you see in old spy movies. The Bureau utilized state-of-the-art nanotechnology. A technician carefully wove a microscopic, thread-like receiver directly into the collar of my favorite wool cardigan, the exact sweater Sarah always insisted I wear, because it kept my frail bones warm. A secondary biometric sensor was adhered flat against my ribcage, designed to monitor my heart rate and transmit my vitals directly to Dr. Eris in the medical transport down the street. If my heart rate spiked into a danger zone indicating accidental ingestion, they wouldn't even wait for the panic button. They would instantly breach the walls. As I looked in the motel mirror, seeing the invisible harness of my own salvation, I felt the last lingering vestiges of my old life burn away. I was ready for war. Thursday morning arrived with a bitter, biting chill that seeped deep into my bones. I parked my truck in the driveway of my own home, the very place I had spent 3 decades protecting, and prepared to deliver the final, most important performance of my entire life. I took a slow, deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward and my posture visibly deteriorate. I forced a slight, noticeable tremor into my hands and practiced the vacant, confused stare of a man whose mind was quietly slipping away into total darkness. I pushed the heavy oak door open and shuffled slowly into the front hallway. David and Sarah were waiting for me in the living room, radiating a sickening aura of manufactured relief. David immediately rushed forward, grabbing my canvas duffel bag from my hands with exaggerated theatrical concern. He wrapped his arm tightly around my frail shoulders, treating me with the delicate, condescending care one might reserve for a lost toddler. He asked me how my remote cabin retreat was, perfectly pitching his voice to sound incredibly soothing and patient. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an expensive linen apron, beaming with a wide, predatory smile. She rushed over and kissed my cheek, cooing loudly about how terribly worried they had been about me being all alone in the freezing woods. They played the roles of the devoted, loving children to absolute perfection, completely unaware that I knew exactly what was hiding beneath their flawless suburban masks. David gently guided me toward the worn leather recliner by the large bay window, instructing me to rest my tired legs. As I sank into the cushions, I looked around the spacious living room. I stared at the solid brick fireplace I had meticulously built with my own two hands during our second summer in this house. I remembered Martha standing right there on the canvas dropcloth, wiping plaster dust from her brow, handing me the heavy masonry trowel with a bright, beautiful smile. Every single piece of crown molding, every polished floorboard, and every painted wall in this home was steeped in our shared history, constructed on a foundation of absolute love and mutual sacrifice. Looking across the room at watching him cheerfully adjust the thermostat, while secretly calculating the exact moment of my death, a profound, quiet realization washed over me. I finally understood that family is not defined by shared blood or a common last name. Biological connection is nothing but a mere biological accident. True family is defined entirely by loyalty, by unwavering integrity, and by the sacred duty to protect one another from the cruelties of the world. The man standing in my living room wearing a tailored designer suit and checking his expensive watch was a complete and utter stranger. I sat there and silently mourned the loss of my only son. I did not mourn him today in this room because the boy I raised had actually died many long years ago. He had been slowly and quietly consumed by his own insatiable greed, replaced entirely by a hollow, calculating shell of a human being who viewed his own parents as nothing more than disposable financial assets. The grief that had paralyzed me for the last 12 months finally evaporated completely, leaving behind only a cold, unbreakable resolve to see absolute justice served. The rest of the afternoon passed in a tense, suffocating blur of artificial domestic bliss. I played the part of the severely disoriented victim flawlessly. When David casually asked me about the fishing conditions up in Wisconsin, I deliberately stumbled over my words, claiming I could not quite remember the name of the lake or the specific highway route I took to get there. I watched Sarah shoot him a quick, victorious glance from across the marble kitchen island. They were entirely convinced that their heavy daily sedatives had permanently damaged my cognitive functions, paving the perfect, seamless path for the final act of their dark conspiracy. Every time I shifted in my leather chair, I could feel the microscopic audio transmitter securely taped to my chest. A cold, hard reminder of the heavily armed federal intervention team waiting silently in the shadows just outside my property line. Agent Harrison and his tactical unit were listening to every single word spoken inside this house, waiting for the precise, undeniable moment of lethal intent. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the hardwood floors, the atmosphere in the house grew incredibly thick. The unspoken anticipation radiating from David and Sarah was palpable and heavy. They moved around the kitchen with a frantic, buzzing energy, setting the formal dining table with Martha's best antique porcelain plates and polishing the expensive silver cutlery. Tonight was my 71st birthday, and they were meticulously preparing a magnificent celebratory feast to deliberately mask a premeditated execution. Every passing minute brought me closer to the final explosive confrontation that would completely destroy the fraudulent lives they had so carefully built. I was gently escorted into the formal dining room and seated at the head of the heavy oak table. The room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the crystal chandelier, completely masking the dark, sinister reality of the evening. David sat to my left, pouring sparkling water and laughing about a fabricated story from his non-existent investment firm. Sarah bustled back and forth from the kitchen, bringing out trays of roasted vegetables and a perfectly seared prime rib. The entire charade was absolutely sickening, but I maintained my confused, grateful smile, thanking them repeatedly for going to such incredible trouble for an old man who barely deserved it. Every bite of the perfectly seared prime rib felt like chewing on dry leather, but I forced myself to swallow, washing it down with small, deliberate sips of ice water. To elevate the psychological pressure, I decided to test the structural integrity of their conscience one final time. I let my fork clatter softly against the antique porcelain plate and looked up, adopting a misty, nostalgic gaze. "Your mother used to make prime rib for my birthday. I murmured, pitching my voice to tremble with authentic-sounding grief. Do you remember David? The year you turned 10, she spent 3 hours in the kitchen just to get the crust exactly the way we liked it. She always put everyone else first. She had the purest heart of anyone I've ever known. I watched his face intently, searching for even a microscopic fracture in his sociopathic armor. A fleeting shadow of guilt. A sudden inability to maintain eye contact, nothing. David simply reached across the table, placing his warm, perfectly manicured hand over mine, and offered a smile so deeply saturated in fake empathy it made my stomach churn. I remember Dad. He lied smoothly, his pulse completely steady. She was an angel. We miss her every single day. That's exactly why Sarah and I wanted to make tonight so special for you. We know how hard these milestones are without her. We just want you to feel loved and safe. Sarah nodded in enthusiastic agreement, reaching for her wineglass. She would want you to be happy, Thomas. She wouldn't want you to sit around missing her and feeling sad all the time. The absolute grotesque nature of their performance was staggering. They were sitting in the very house where they had murdered my wife, invoking her sacred memory to pacify me while actively preparing to stop my heart. It required an agonizing amount of physical restraint to keep my hands flat on the table, to prevent myself from reaching across the white linen and wrapping my fingers around his treacherous throat. I simply nodded, wiping a fabricated tear from my cheek, letting them believe they had successfully manipulated the fragile old man. I was giving them the rope inch by inch, and they were gleefully tying their own nooses. As the main course was finally cleared away, David leaned back in his chair, clapping his hands together with theatrical enthusiasm. He announced that it was time for the grand finale of the evening. Sarah walked through the swinging kitchen doors, carrying a large, beautifully decorated chocolate birthday cake, a single golden candle burning brightly in the center of the dark frosting. She placed it gently on the table right in front of me, her eyes shining with that familiar, terrifyingly fake affection. Then she turned around and walked over to the dark wooden liquor cabinet resting against the far wall. She reached inside and pulled out a tall, elegant crystal glass, already filled to the brim with my absolute favorite vintage red wine. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers grip the delicate crystal stem with terrifying absolute casualness. This was the exact glass she had secretly prepared in the kitchen just moments before, while I was sitting quietly in the other room. This was the exact glass, heavily laced with a massive, lethal dosage of the untraceable cardiac stimulant, meant to stop my heart forever. She walked slowly back to the table, the dark red liquid swaying gently against the edges of the crystal glass, and placed the poisoned wine directly next to my deliberately trembling right hand. I stared down at the beautiful, deadly liquid, knowing that the precise moment I reached for that crystal glass, I would instantly trigger the absolute catastrophic end of my son's existence. The silence in the grand dining room stretched into an agonizing, unbearable eternity. The single golden candle on the dark chocolate cake flickered slightly in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows across David and Sarah's tense faces. They were both completely still, their eyes locked onto my right hand with a hungry, breathless anticipation. This was the grand climax of their twisted masterpiece. I could hear the faint, rapid ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second echoing like a heavy hammer strike against a steel anvil. I slowly lifted my purposefully trembling hand from my lap, playing my pathetic part to the very last bitter frame. My fingers hovered just inches away from the smooth crystal stem of the poisoned wineglass. I saw David's jaw clench tightly, a microscopic muscle ticking violently in his cheek. He was so close to his $5 million salvation, he could practically taste the freedom. Sarah's breathing had grown incredibly shallow. Her lips parted slightly in an expression of pure predatory ecstasy. In their minds, they were already visualizing the oceanfront beach houses, the cleared syndicate debts, the total financial liberty purchased directly with my blood. I let my hand drop heavily back down to the wooden table, stopping inches from the crystal glass. The profound disappointment that flashed across their faces was instantaneous and entirely palpable. "David," I said, my voice suddenly losing its frail, trembling edge. The single word cut through the heavy, suffocating air with cold, commanding clarity. I sat up perfectly straight in my chair, rolling my aching shoulders back, and completely shedding the hunched, defeated posture of the victim they thought they had conquered. David blinked rapidly, genuine confusion, momentarily replacing his eager anticipation. "Dad, what's wrong? Aren't you going to try the vintage wine Sarah poured it especially for you?" I looked directly into his eyes, stripping away every single ounce of paternal warmth. I let him see the retired structural engineer. I let him see the calculating man who knew exactly how the building was rigged to fall. "I know about the hidden Cayman Island accounts, David," I said softly, the words landing like physical blows across the table. "I know about the $4 million you desperately owe the underground syndicate. I know about the forged property deed, the massive life insurance policy. And I know exactly what Sarah injected into my insulin pens upstairs." The color completely drained from David's face in a fraction of a second, leaving his skin a sickening ashen gray. Sarah stumbled backward away from the table, her manicured hand flying to cover her mouth, her icy blue eyes wide with sudden, explosive terror. The carefully constructed, flawless facade of their suburban perfection violently shattered into 1,000 jagged, irreparable pieces right in front of me. "And David?" I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper as my left hand slipped deep into my trouser pocket, my thumb wrapping tightly around the plastic panic button. "I know exactly what you fed your mother on the very last night of her life." Before he could even open his mouth to form another pathetic lie, my thumb pressed down hard on the transmitter. David was slammed violently onto the hardwood floor of the dining room, his expensive tailored suit wrinkling as heavy steel handcuffs locked around his wrists. He writhed desperately against the crushing weight of the federal agents, screaming at the top of his lungs for me to help him. I stood perfectly still near the head of the table, looking down at his terrified face with absolutely zero emotion. I told him in a quiet, unwavering voice that my only son had died the exact same night my beautiful wife did. The pathetic, wealthy man currently sobbing on the floor was nothing more than the ruthless murderer who killed them both. I turned my back on him completely and walked out the front door, leaving the flashing red and blue lights to illuminate the absolute destruction of his fraudulent life. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as my son and daughter-in-law were shoved into the back of armored federal vehicles, their pristine suburban masks forever shattered. The moment the heavy steel doors of the federal transport vans slammed shut, the chaotic energy in my house shifted into a cold, methodical hum of forensic procedure. The gawking neighbors who had stepped out onto their manicured lawns in their bathrobes were quickly pushed back behind yellow police tape. Dozens of agents in dark windbreakers swarmed the property, their heavy boots tracking over the polished hardwood floors. Dr. Eris, moving with surgical precision, immediately secured the poisoned crystal wine glass, sealing it inside a rigid tamper-proof evidence container. She gave me a brief, solemn nod, a silent acknowledgement of the lethal bullet I had just successfully dodged. Flashbulbs strobed rapidly in the kitchen and the upstairs master bedroom as the evidence collection teams began meticulously cataloging the tampered insulin pens and the hidden keylogger on my computer. I stood alone in the center of the grand foyer, watching the hyper-organized dismantling of the crime scene that used to be my peaceful sanctuary. Agent Harrison approached me holding a digital clipboard. He didn't offer a celebratory smile or a triumphant pat on the back. He knew there were no true victors in this house tonight. "The syndicate task force just gave the green light," Harrison informed me quietly over the din of the radio chatter. "Simultaneous raids are happening across the city right now. David's underground creditors are being rounded up as we speak. We got the whole network, Thomas. Your son's debt just bought the Bureau the biggest organized crime bust of the decade." I absorbed the information, slowly feeling a hollow, echoing emptiness expanding in my chest. The adrenaline that had kept my hands steady and my mind razor-sharp for the past 48 hours was finally beginning to evaporate, leaving behind an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. I looked around at the federal agents bagging up the remnants of my shattered family. The trap had worked flawlessly. The corrupted structure had been successfully demolished. But as I stood there, in the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the living room windows, the silence of the empty house felt heavier and far more absolute than it ever had before. The following weeks passed in a relentless, exhausting blur of formal depositions, tactical interrogations, and intense courtroom proceedings. The federal prosecutors did not even need my verbal testimony to secure a flawless victory. The mountain of concrete evidence we had meticulously gathered was utterly undeniable. The video of David explicitly confessing to the murder of his mother played on the large screens of the federal courthouse, echoing chillingly through the silent room. The independent toxicologist testified about the lethal cardiac stimulant injected directly into my medicinal insulin pens. Bradley Mitchell methodically dismantled the offshore banking ledgers, exposing the massive $4 million syndicate debt and the fraudulent bridge loan secured with my forged property deeds. Faced with the overwhelming, inescapable reality of their crimes, the brilliant defense attorneys David had frantically hired immediately urged a plea deal. But the federal judge, absolutely disgusted by the sheer calculating cruelty of their actions, rejected any possibility of leniency. Sarah attempted to turn federal witness against her husband at the very last moment. She sobbed theatrically on the witness stand, claiming she was a terrified, manipulated victim of the aggressive financial desperation David created. Her performance was spectacular, but the prosecutor simply played the crisp audio recording of her laughing. In my kitchen, callously wondering what color luxury sports car she would buy with my life insurance payout. That single horrific laugh sealed her ultimate fate. Both David and Sarah were formally indicted and convicted of first-degree murder, federal wire fraud, and aggravated conspiracy. They both received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. They were stripped of their expensive assets, corporate titles, and freedom, but the federal penitentiary was not the end of the brutal punishment for David. The underground criminal syndicate. He owed $4 million to did not forgive outstanding debts, especially when their borrower suddenly became a permanent ward of the state. With David locked away in a maximum security facility, stripped of all his protections, the massive financial debt became a terrifying, inescapable shadow. He had gambled with dangerous, violent men, and now he belonged to them entirely behind concrete walls. I attended the final sentencing hearing sitting quietly in the back row of the grand courtroom. When the heavy wooden gavel finally fell, echoing like a thunderclap, I did not feel a sudden rush of victorious joy or triumphant relief. I simply felt the cold, necessary closure of a compromised structural foundation finally settling into the dirt. The rot was completely removed. I returned to my quiet suburban house that evening, stepping into the grand foyer. The profound silence of the empty rooms no longer felt oppressive or terrifying. It was merely silent. I walked into the formal dining room, staring at the exact spot where the poison had spilled onto the floorboards. I realized I could not stay in the place where Martha had been so brutally betrayed. The walls held too many dark, suffocating memories of deception. I contacted Bradley Mitchell and his elite financial team the very next morning. I instructed them to list the massive property on the real estate market immediately. It sold within 2 weeks to a young, oblivious couple looking to start a fresh family. I liquidated every single corrupted asset David had attempted to steal from me. The fraudulent $5 million life insurance policy was officially voided by the corporate underwriters, but my own honest, hard-earned retirement funds were completely recovered and securely restored to my private accounts. The lucrative sale of the sprawling house provided me with significant additional capital. The physical act of packing up my life was highly therapeutic. I hired a professional estate liquidator to clear out everything I did not strictly need. I watched dispassionately as strangers carried away the massive oak dining table where I had nearly been assassinated, the expensive leather sofas, and the grandfather clock that had ticked down the seconds to my planned demise. I kept only the items that held pure, untainted memories. Martha's favorite gardening tools, a handful of framed photographs from our early years, and her antique cherry wood writing desk, which I painstakingly repaired and polished. The dark green leather journal remained locked safely inside its bottom drawer, a permanent physical reminder of the cost of blind trust. Moving into the city center completely severed my ties to the suburban illusion I had lived in for so long. The hum of the city traffic replaced the quiet rustle of the oak trees, and the anonymity of the crowded streets provided a strange, comforting blanket. I was no longer the tragic, grieving widower of the quiet cul-de-sac. I was a ghost who had successfully crawled out of his own grave. I spent my first few nights in the new apartment, sitting by the large glass window, drinking a simple cup of black coffee, never herbal tea, and watching the city lights flicker to life. The millions of glowing windows across the skyline represented countless other families, countless other stories, and undoubtedly countless other hidden betrayals. But I knew I could not simply sit back and quietly fade into the background of a peaceful retirement. My father had always taught me that the true worth of any man is defined entirely by the enduring legacy he builds for others. I took a massive portion of my recovered fortune and officially established an organization I named the Martha Bennett Foundation. I dedicated the entire foundation to providing free aggressive legal representation and forensic financial protection for vulnerable senior citizens facing elder abuse. I personally hired fierce, relentless accountants and dedicated attorneys to actively hunt down predatory relatives who tried to exploit the fragile and elderly. My beautiful wife had lost her life trying to confront the greed of her own child, but her name would now serve as a powerful, indestructible shield for thousands of defenseless people across the state. I will never forget the very first case the foundation officially took on. Her name was Eleanor, a frail 78-year-old widow whose own nephew had fraudulently secured power of attorney over her estate. He had been quietly draining her modest retirement accounts to fund his failing startup company, leaving her unable to even afford her winter heating bills. When she came to my office, her hands were shaking with the exact same terrifying, heartbreaking betrayal I had felt standing in Martha's ruined sewing room. I deployed my team immediately. Within 48 hours, our forensic accountants had completely frozen the nephew's illicit accounts, and our legal division had secured a massive federal injunction against him. I personally attended his arraignment at the downtown courthouse. As he walked out of the courtroom out on bail and looking completely shell-shocked by the sudden destruction of his financial world, I stepped directly into his path. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I just looked at him with the cold, immovable certainty of a man who had already dismantled a much larger monster. I told him he would return every single stolen penny with interest, or my foundation would personally ensure he spent the next decade in a concrete cell. Watching the absolute terror bloom in his eyes, knowing that Eleanor was safely sleeping in her own warm house that night, I finally felt the heavy, lingering darkness in my soul begin to fracture. It was the first time since Martha died that I felt like I was actually building a sturdy, reliable foundation again. Exactly 1 year after the brutal federal sting operation, I celebrated my 72nd birthday entirely alone. I drove my truck out to the serene, isolated lake where Martha and I used to walk every single Sunday morning during the early years of our long marriage. The crisp autumn air filled my tired lungs, carrying the familiar scent of pine needles and fresh water. I stood quietly at the edge of the wooden dock, watching the gentle ripples disturb the calm surface of the lake. I was an old man without a biological family. I had no children to call me, no grandchildren to spoil, and no wife to hold my hand as the sun slowly set. But looking out across the vast, shimmering water, I realized with absolute certainty that I was not broken. The paralyzing grief that had once threatened to consume me completely had transformed into a profound driving sense of purpose. I had successfully dismantled a monster. I had protected the sacred honor of my wife. I had fiercely defended my own dignity against an unimaginable betrayal. I watched the golden sunlight reflect off the rippling water, feeling the gentle, invisible presence of Martha standing right beside me in the quiet autumn breeze. She would be incredibly proud of the foundation we had built. She would be proud that her tragic, heartbreaking end had ultimately become the powerful armor that protected so many others from the dark cruelty of human greed. The strong, unyielding foundation was my true legacy. I took one last breath, turning away. There is a dangerous misconception that blood ties automatically guarantee loyalty, love, and protection. My journey taught me the hardest truth a father can ever learn: greed can rot the strongest family tree from the inside out. Never ignore your instincts simply because the person standing in front of you shares your last name. True love is demonstrated through consistent respect and actions, not empty words or convenient smiles. When you suspect betrayal, do not confront it with emotion. Confront it with cold, calculated facts. Protect your dignity, guard your legacy, and remember that saving yourself means letting go completely. Have you ever experienced a betrayal from someone you completely trusted? How did you handle the heartbreaking truth? Share your story in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life lessons. Your support means the world to me.